Okay, thanks so much.
Heavenly Father, we are thankful for this good day that we have been blessed with, and please bless that we will be able to learn a lot about history today, and that we will be able to take away lots from this this class, and we say these things in Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thanks a lot, Walter. And hello, Mr. Anderson. Are you with us? Let's see. Okay, well, let's get started here. Okay, so Walter, were you able to do the readings, Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania?
I did some of them. I did not get them all finished, though.
Oh, okay. Which ones were you able to read of the three?
I read most of number 2.
Okay. Well, number 2 is a great one, so I think you'll be able to enjoy our lecture today as we discuss number 2 and the others as well, because they all relate to each other. Good afternoon, Mrs. Godlewski. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
Good. I'm grateful to be able to hear you.
Yay.
I never know if it'll work or not, so I'm grateful you're here. Well, let's start then. So let's see, it's going to advance. Okay, here we go. So if we remember, the last thing that we talked about was the Stamp Act and the reaction to the Stamp Act, and we talked about Daniel Delaney's reaction, what he wrote about that act. Well, in 1766, the Stamp Act was repealed, which we think would be this wonderful cause to rejoice in the colonies, and it was, for many reasons. But at the same time, even as it was repealed, Britain flexed its governmental muscles and let the colonies know who was boss. And so could I have someone read the Declaratory Act here?
I can read it.
Thanks so much, Walter.
Declaratory Act repealed Stamp Act, but asserted that Parliament had full power and authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and people of America subjects to the Crown of Great Britain in all cases whatsoever.
Excellent. So what in that statement, which was a quote from the Declaratory Act, do you see that may have made the colonists uneasy?
The part that says full power.
I'm sorry, what was that? Could you say that one more time, please?
The part that says full power and authority to make laws and statutes, sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and people of America. So that would kind of, because the colonies like being free, and that was saying that Great Britain had power to kind of do whatever they wanted with them.
That's right. Yeah, excellent reasoning there, Walter. You know, this was very interesting because Britain was saying, okay, fine, in this instance, maybe we shouldn't tax you in this way, and so we'll stop. But we want to reassert that we have the power to tax you. And in fact, not just to tax, but if we look at this here, right, to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. This was an ominous portent of things to come, and it would give the colonists much angst, as their victory in having the Stamp Act repealed was bittersweet, truly. Well, it's interesting because in 1767, Britain tries again to tax the colonies, and they have this Townsend Revenue Act, which are also called the Townsend Revenue or the Townsend Duties, which create a tax on tea, glass, lead, paper, and paint. Now, this was an external tax, and if we remember, Delaney said that an external tax to regulate trade should be justified and acceptable. But it's very interesting that as we look at this tax, it does more than simply regulate trade. And so Britain here is really seeing if the colonists mean what they say. They're going to take them at their word and say, okay, fine, you don't want an internal tax like the Stamp Act? Well, here's an external tax. Let's see what you do with it.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, go ahead.
So Dickinson on page 7 said that paper and glass, they were prohibited from getting them anywhere else but from Great Britain. Is that true of tea and paint and lead as well?
So basically, there weren't the manufacturing capabilities and what you could call sort of proto-factories, in the American colonies that there were in Britain. And so especially with things like making lead, it was hard for them to do. Of course, they could do it, but it was terribly expensive, and they really just didn't have the ability to do it in any means that would make it worth their while. Because it was just so expensive. On the other hand, we have the Industrial Revolution happening in Britain in its early stages, and so therefore they could create it much more cheaply, and it was very easy for them to do. And so really, as Dickinson does point out, right, the Britons are sort of holding the Americans over a barrel. They don't really have the means to do it in any way that makes it practical for them. That's a great question, Wendy. Well, it's interesting here because if we look at this act, the Townsend Revenue Act was aimed as obviously as the Stamp Act at raising a revenue. And so Dulaney's argument of internal equals bad and external is okay, right, becomes inadequate. The colonists need a new argument behind which to rally, and John Dickinson gave them that argument. And it's the argument found in Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer, which you read for today's class. So just a little bit about Dickinson here as we continue in our brief context part of the lesson. Born in 1732, died in 1808. Very famous figure. He'll come up again and again. Wouldn't sign the Declaration, but signed the Constitution. Conservative Pennsylvania lawyer, and so it is interesting to note that he's talking about letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania. Well, he certainly wasn't a farmer. In fact, he was actually one of the richest men in the 13 colonies. But yet, why do you think he might call himself a farmer in Pennsylvania in these letters? Or at least portray himself that way?
Create sympathy?
Great, to create sympathy. And specifically, sympathy for whom?
For people who tax, these taxes I'm sure affected the poor more than they did the rich.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent, right? Thank you so much for that. Trying to affect sympathy for the common man, right? Sort of speaking for the everyman in America. Hopefully, he wanted this series of letters to constitute, or at least to seem like it was the sentiment of the average American, and not just something that intellectuals were worried about or that the rich were worried about. He was trying to show this as truly, a cause for all. Well, it's interesting because Dickinson, he did spend lots of his life representing the people, even though he was in the propertied class and a very wealthy man. He served in lower houses in both Delaware and Pennsylvania. He prepared the Declaration of Rights and Grievances for the Stamp Act Congress that met and that was part of the pressure tactics that eventually brought about the repeal in 1766 of the Stamp Act. To protest the Townsend duties, he wrote the Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania between November 1767 and then January 1768. And so, as we learn a little bit more about these, keep in mind that they're published in newspapers and pamphlets all over the colonies. They weren't just random letters written to people. He actually wrote them as letters, but yet they were published widely. And his ideas moved Americans one step closer to revolution. And so the whole point of today's lesson is for you, through your reasoning and relating, and then, of course, your research that you've done coming to class, having read these articles, see if you can find out how Dickinson's ideas moved Americans one step closer to revolution. So we'll try to flesh those ideas out as we go here. Well, here's a picture of...
Question.
Sure, go ahead. No, that's fine. These are great questions.
Did people believe he was a farmer, or did they know that that was just kind of a joke?
Well, and the thing is, in the style of the day, it wasn't a joke. It was more, I want to write as if I am a common man and explain the arguments of the common man. And so everybody knew it was John Dickinson.
So just like with Cato's letters, they weren't really written by Cato, but they're creating them as if they were. But my question is, did people know that a rich lawyer was writing them?
Yes, they knew that Dickinson was writing them.
Okay.
Yes, yeah, they knew specifically who was writing them. Excellent question. Well, if we start then delving in, because we've done the research, now let's do the reason. So what does Dickinson reaffirm? And this is really important, because remember, we're not ready to sever ties yet. What does Dickinson reaffirm in the second and third paragraph of Letters from a Farmer? And this is letter 2.
Can you hear me?
I'm sorry, Heidi, did you say something?
I just wondered, can you hear me okay today?
Well, you've been kind of quiet. What you just said, I was able to hear loud and clear.
Okay, now I think it's working.
Yeah, no, now you're great.
Okay, so what I gathered that he's trying to say is that Great Britain does have the authority to tax on some, to tax on some things.
Okay, so in your mind, he's reaffirming that ability to tax in certain instances.
Yes.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. What else do we see? What else can we reason out here? Especially if we look at the bottom sort of 3 lines of the second paragraph.
That they're part of and dependent on their mother country.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And not only are they part of and dependent, right, but who is sovereign in this relationship, specifically?
The king.
Parliament.
Yeah, it's interesting here. He mentions Parliament. He says this power is lodged in Parliament, and we are as much dependent on Great Britain as a perfectly free people can be on another. Now this reasoning will be out the window in a couple years, so just sort of stay tuned. But it's interesting to note that still, as much as he's saying in all of these letters, we're not represented, we are not giving our consent, therefore your taxation in those instances in terms of trying to get revenue, that's not legitimate, but yet you're still sovereign to us. This is a very interesting line that I think sometimes I find myself scratching my head at, but yet I try to step back into their shoes, and we have to remember that at this point, the revolution wasn't a foregone conclusion. And at this point, Dickinson was calling for rights within the British Empire, his rights within the Empire of Liberty. Okay. If we continue the reasoning then, what does he challenge in the third paragraph of letter 2?
The idea of using the regulation of trade to impose a tax on just a part of the people to raise revenue.
Yeah. Excellent, right? And can you find a line that mentions that?
Yet those duties were always imposed with design. Well, I'm going to skip a little bit, but till the Stamp Act administration, then I'm skipping 2 lines, duties were always imposed with design to restrain the commerce of one part. I'm skipping more. The raising of a revenue was never intended.
Yeah, excellent, right? And I love how, as Dickinson's writing, it's just so neat to me to really see his mind at work here. But he says, I have looked over every statute relating to these colonies, from their first settlement to this time, and I find every one of them founded on this principle, right? And this is the principle, right, of not taxing for revenue, right? And he says, from the Stamp Act on, right, suddenly, with Grenville's ministry, things have changed. And yet, you don't have our consent. How can this be, right? How can it be that you're raising revenue without our consent? And so this is the great challenge. This is the gauntlet that he throws down to anyone who will listen, and especially to the British government. So excellent reasoning there, Wendy. Well, this is if we move then to page 7, if we just flip the page here, and we look at paragraph 6. Can you reason, what does Dickinson say about internal and external taxes in this paragraph 6 on page 7?
Is it the one that starts with that we may legally be bound?
Yes.
Okay.
The they're raising money just from the colonies because they export those things to the colonies.
That's right. Excellent. And so if we look here, this Walter, actually, would you read that for us? That way we're make sure we're all on the same page here. And that's just that paragraph 6, starting with that we may legally.
That we may legally be bound to pay any general duties on these commodities relative to the regulation of trade is granted, but we being obliged by here laws take from them from Great Britain any special duties imposed on their exportation to us only with intention to raise a revenue from us only are as much taxes upon us as those imposed by the Stamp Act.
Okay, excellent. So now, what does he mention there for external taxation? What does he say specifically? What 3-word phrase?
Legally be bound?
The one where he says, well, isn't he just saying your external taxes are internal taxes?
Mm-hmm.
You're using trade duties. You're using duties to raise a revenue from us. So it is just as much an internal tax as anything else.
That's right. Right. That's exactly what he's saying. In fact, he's saying, all right, if we look here, okay, he talks about regulation of trade, which the colonists had originally said, if we remember Delaney, well, that was okay, right? And so they're taking something that's external and that's supposed to be all right, okay, and now he's saying you've made it just like the Stamp Act, which, as we know, is internal, because it's raising revenue just as much. It's not just to take care of business and make sure the empire is working. It's specifically to raise the revenue on our heads, and of course it's done without consent. Now, if we think about this, how does this argument differ from Delaney's? Can you reason the difference?
Well, Delaney said that external taxes were okay, that Britain had a right to promote itself through regulation of trade, and that we thrive if Britain thrives. But Dickinson is saying, no, these external taxes are the same as an internal tax.
Excellent, right? And Walter, why are these the same as an internal tax? Why are these external taxes the same as an internal tax?
Because they're being used to make money or revenue, not control their trade.
Yeah, excellent, right? Because they're for the raising of revenue. And so, then what's the bottom line for Dickinson? What's the litmus test of a tax?
It must be to control the government or the empire or whatever.
Or to raise revenue.
Mm-hmm, that's right. So if it raises revenue, whether it's internal or external, it's bad. And it's interesting to know as we look here, because Dickinson will be very specific about the difference when he talks about how it actually affects individuals' pocketbooks. Well, let's just look here. He summarizes his complaints in the last 2 lines of paragraph 4 on page 8. So let's read that together. And then let's ask ourselves the question, why did he believe that either internal or external taxes for the purpose of revenue violated the colonists' rights? So let's first read the last 2 lines of paragraph 4 on page 8. We'll do that researching, and then we'll reason together. So Heidi, would you read that for us, please?
Starting with what?
Last 2 lines of paragraph 4 on page 8. So you can start with those imposed by the late act, or if you want, you can start, does it therefore follow?
Those imposed by the late act, okay. Does it therefore follow that the last is no violation of our rights, though it is calculated for the same purpose the other was, that is, to raise money upon us without our consent?
Excellent.
This would, oh, okay.
Oh, yeah. So what is the last, do you think, if you've done that researching and if you read it before class? What's the last act as opposed to the first or the other?
The Townsend?
That's right. So the last, meaning the Townsend duties, right, for the same purpose as the other, meaning the Stamp Act. Okay, in that program. So just make sure we're clear about that there. And so then, can we reason then? Okay, so why is this violating the colonists' rights?
Because it's raising money without their consent.
Right.
It's
Okay,
raising
always
revenue.
the bottom line.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Thank you, Heidi. Right, without the consent. And so once again, and I hope we're grasping why this is so important. Even though we always talk about consent, but really, why is consent so important? What's the big deal about consent?
Otherwise, it's a form of slavery.
Mm-hmm. And let's think back to our readings from the Glorious Revolution. How can we then relate the importance of consent to those readings? If we think about Locke and his 5 big ideas, how does consent relate to those ideas about government? Walter, do you remember those 5 ideas?
Yeah. Those were like natural rights, which were like the property, and it was those ones, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So if we think of things, right, how do we start out? What's the very first big idea of Locke?
The state of nature, that we're born without government.
Excellent, right? So important to remember, okay? This is Dickinson, okay, as he's thinking, right? He's thinking about what Locke would articulate as this sort of first big idea that we've called, okay, that, yeah, we're born without government, okay? And so then what happens?
Then we have the right to make social contracts.
That's right. And as part of that social contract, what comes into the picture? What do we create?
We create government to protect our natural rights.
Excellent, right? So if we think about that then, what does that have to do with consent?
Well, we should have say over what we want done to us, and so we choose who we want to represent us and to give our consent for what we allow to have done to us.
Yeah, definitely. And, not only should it be that way, but we need to remember that these philosophers of government, right, they would say it has to be that way because we created government. It's very interesting, as we look, I think there are a lot of people in the world who, and perhaps some of them work in the government, that believe that government is there and that it has been there and that it will be there, but we need to remember that that's not a given, right? That people give government power, and that when the people cease to give that power, the government truly is illegitimate. Now, if we bring that back to consent, right, this has everything to do. Dickinson is basically saying, wait a minute, we are not giving you life if we don't give you consent. Therefore, you don't have the physical ability to rise up as your own creation and tell us what to do because we give you life. So that's why this is just so important. It all goes back to these Lockean principles, which are just the summary of so many sentiments for ages about man's agency in life. It gets back to the eternal principle of agency. And so just keep that in mind here. This raising a revenue without consent will become incredibly important, not just because it hurts people's pocketbooks, but because philosophically it goes against the entire nature of the government that people themselves invented. Well, if we think then, and this goes a little bit back to what Wendy was talking about at the very beginning, what other argument then does Dickinson give against the Townsend duties? And if you need help remembering or refreshing, see the last 3 paragraphs on page 8 and the last paragraph on page 9. What was the other
like
argument?
You said, that they weren't manufacturers, so they were either prohibited from getting those things anywhere but from Britain, or it it was too difficult to manufacture it themselves.
That's right. Excellent. And so this will be a big point for Dickinson. And did you see this running throughout a couple of the letters? This argument, because it's interesting that Dickinson will also bring in sort of this very practical. Because think of it, he's talking about the philosophical, right, with sort of these Lockean ideas, but then he brings it right back down to the ground. And sort of where the rubber meets the road. Now, of course, they didn't have the rubber meeting the road back then, but we can use that expression today. And says, listen, we don't have any other alternatives, and so you're forcing us to do something that's against our will, so it's doubly wrong, right? Let's see. Can we find a quote from Dickinson that supports that in one of those two places? Walter, can you find a quote for us? One of the bottom paragraphs on page 8 or the last paragraph on page 9?
That supports what thing again? Can you say that again?
Oh, this argument of Dickinson that because we either aren't able or because it's not advantageous for us to make our own goods that are being taxed by the Townsend duties, that's also a reason why we shouldn't have those duties.
Well, there's this one, it's kind of about that. I am told there are but 2 or 3 glass houses, and then he talks about paper mills, and then he says that it would take like a few years to get those up and running and going, and it would also be expensive. And so they can't really effectively make their own.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. And I love how Dickinson said it here on the bottom of page 9. He says, if there is a dependent state that is being forced to take certain commodities from the ruling state alone, then if we skip down, it says those commodities should never be loaded with duties for the sole purpose of levying money on the dependent state. And I think it is interesting if we think about those implications today. Well, if we continue then the reasoning, how would you summarize, in one sentence, Dickinson's argument? And you may want to read the last paragraph of letter 2 again as you think about your one sentence. And I'd like each of you to give me a sentence. So the person who goes first will run the least risk of saying something repetitive.
Okay, well, I'll go. Just on the top of page 10, it says, the single question is whether the Parliament can legally impose duties to be paid by the people of these colonies only for the sole purpose of raising a revenue on the commodities which she obliges us to take from her alone. And then it says whether the Parliament can legally take money out of our pockets without our consent. Okay. And then the very last thing, if they can, our boasted liberty is but a sound and nothing else.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so in your own words, what would you say Dickinson's argument is? If you were to explain it to your daughter Sophie, what would you say?
I would say that his argument was asking the question of whether Parliament has the right to tax us without our consent.
Excellent. Thank you for that. What do you think, Walter?
So, what are we supposed to be looking for? I didn't quite get that.
Okay, well, on the screen, it says, how could you summarize in one sentence Dickinson's argument, just his overall argument
Okay.
for this second letter?
Well, that tax needs to not be for revenue, but to control trade.
Okay. Great. Thanks so much for that. And what about you, Wendy?
Maybe I would say if Parliament can turn an external tax in, Parliament has turned an external tax into an internal tax, and therefore they're legally taking our money without our consent, and our liberty is a sham.
Excellent, right? And I love how you brought in both that word internal and that word external, because really this is so important in terms of moving the argument forward here, whereas Delaney had said, internal bad, external okay. Dickinson saying, wait, because both internal and external are bad if they're raising our revenue, and we have to be careful because this is being done without our consent. Well, if we relate then, if we look at letter 4 on page 10, there's some wonderful quotes in these letters, in letter 4 and letter 7. And I hope you enjoyed them. But if we look at this statement here that I've written with quotes from this letter, taxes should be voluntary gifts to the government based on need and necessity, gifts of the people to the crown, or you could say government, to be employed for public uses. How do you feel about this statement, and how does it apply to you? Let's relate.
Well, I don't think too many people would want to, or at least nowadays, would give a voluntary gift to the government.
Okay. But should it be voluntary?
Yes, I think it should be voluntary. Well, maybe not, because some people just wouldn't want to pay taxes if it was voluntary.
Okay.
And the government would kind of fail.
Okay.
But it should be, the majority of people, or maybe like you can kind of average out how much taxes everyone wants to pay, and get the average, and that can be the taxes.
Okay. Yeah. I think we should be really careful as we think about what Dickinson means by voluntary. What do you think he means by voluntary?
I'm not sure, because he says all these sums were levied upon the people by virtue of their voluntary gift. The fact that it was levied on the people doesn't sound very voluntary, so I'm confused.
Well, what do you think, Heidi? Do you have any idea what this voluntary might mean in terms of what he is trying to say?
I don't think it was. I think they were still imposed upon the people, but I don't think the people resented them as badly.
Okay, I see what you're saying there. Thank you for that. It's interesting because as Dickinson is talking about voluntary here, he's really trying to say of the people's consent. He's saying that taxes should be of the people's consent, and that they should be only given to things that the people consent are needful or necessary. That taxes aren't owed to the government just because the government's there, but the taxes are gifts, meaning these consensual offerings to be employed for public uses that the people deem are worthy of losing private property for. Does that make sense? That's what he's trying to say, even though perhaps the wording is a little ambiguous there. But that's his bottom line argument. And so if we think about that, how do you feel about that statement?
I feel a lot better about it.
Right.
Because I feel good about it the other way.
Right.
I'm always, when I filled out my taxes each year and you see the little thing where it says you can donate money to the National Treasury, I just always have to laugh. I think, who's donating extra tax money to the Treasury? Right.
Yeah, thank you for that, Wendy. What do you think, Walter? Now that maybe the meaning is perhaps clarified a little bit, how does that seem to you, and why?
Well, I think it's better because before, it just didn't really make sense before, and it seemed, I don't know, just like it wouldn't work. So, yeah.
Definitely. Now, if we think about this, how do these things apply to us? I mean, we pay taxes, right? I mean, Walter indirectly right? Through your family, you're paying taxes at this point. Because is that true? I think, are you 14, Walter?
Yeah.
Okay. So, but if we think about paying taxes here, how does this apply to us?
Basically, I think it's just saying we want to have a say. We want to have our representatives represent what we would choose to give our money to and not have it forced upon us.
Right, and so now this, of course, becomes a sticky situation because now what about if the government is doing things that, perhaps we don't agree with, whatever it may be, and we're still paying taxes? I mean, what should we do?
Elect new leaders.
Okay, right, so try to effect change through electing new representatives. Excellent, right? That's one way to do it. What else?
You could write letters to old representatives.
Okay. So, right, writing
New
letters.
representatives.
Yeah. Excellent, right? Anybody ever written a letter before to government?
I have.
You have? Excellent. Did you remember what it was about?
Yeah.
Would you
It was
share that with us
about-
if you feel okay about that?
Yeah, it was about taxes going to Acorn.
Oh. Wow. When did you write that?
Oh, a little while ago.
Yeah.
It was a few months ago.
Yeah. Well, that's great.
Very nice.
That's wonderful. What about Heidi or Wendy? Have you ever written a letter to the government before?
I have not written a letter. I've called my representatives, though.
Oh, excellent. Same thing, right? Perhaps even better. Wow. Now, did you actually get through? I'm curious.
Well, no, they have someone that answers their phones, but one of them did call me back.
Oh, okay. That's great. And what about you, Wendy?
In my lifetime, probably about 10 letters and probably about 1,000 phone calls.
Okay.
And I've only, I've gotten through to state legislators and talked to them one-on-one, but I've never, unless I've gone to a meeting and gone up to a Senator Bennett or Senator Patch or Representative Matheson, I've been able to catch them in meetings, but never on the phone.
Mm-hmm.
And they just send you form letters back.
Right. Yeah, well, that's great, and I'm glad to hear of all of that political participation, because really, I mean, that's what this is about. Hopefully this is more than just sort of learning some facts and dates and events, that we really want this to have meaning in our lives and have, application. Well, let's continue on then. We have some other wonderful quotes. I was just so excited to read these quotes as I was preparing for this class. Let's see. Could we have somebody read this one for us?
I will.
Thanks so much, Heidi.
Just right off the screen.
Yes, please.
It is inseparably essential to the freedom of a people and the undoubted right of Englishmen that no tax be imposed on them except with their own consent, given personally or by their representatives.
Okay. Now this is very important here, because this is where Dickinson, for the time, starts getting very radical, and this is really interesting. So why do you? Well, perhaps first of all, how do you feel about this quote? Why do you think it's so important, and how does it apply? Essential to the freedom of a people. How so?
Well, I liked back when we were saying that on the last screen that talked about need and necessity, because I think we need to remember that even if the majority of the people consent to a tax, to me we need to get beyond that. We need to make sure that the tax is only being used to support what we consider the proper role of government, which our founders laid out as life, liberty, and property. If it's doing more than that, in my opinion, even if the majority consent to it, it's not to be opposed.
Yeah, thank you for that, Wendy. And so what do you do then if we apply this to ourselves? What do we do if it seems to us that perhaps even the majority is giving consent to something that is unconstitutional?
we get frustrated.
Okay, we get very frustrated, right?
Well, I actually had a conversation about this today,
Yeah.
and in a way there's only so much you can do, but it really comes back to preaching the word, teaching truth, because sometimes that's really the only way you can even try to affect people is trying to teach truth, and hopefully some will hear it.
Excellent, right? Back to that principle of education, right? So important to change people's hearts and minds. In fact, I mean, that's the whole purpose of American Heritage School, to educate hearts and minds in these correct principles as we see them. Thank you so much for that. Well, let's see here. This one I love. I think this quote has so many applications if we think about it. Let's see. Walter, would you read this one for us, please? This is from letter 7.
This is one on the screen right here.
Yes, please.
Okay. The love of liberty is so natural to the human heart that unfeeling tyrants think themselves obliged to accommodate their schemes as much as they can to the appearance of justice and reason, and to deceive those whom they resolve to destroy or oppress by presenting to them a miserable picture of freedom when the inestimable original is lost.
Okay. There's a lot there. So, how do you feel about this quote?
It kind of reminds me, if I'm interpreting it correctly, it kind of reminds me of all this media buzz we have right now that the economy's recovered, everything's fine.
Yeah, thank you for that. I love that current day application, right? I just when I see this, I hone in. My eyes just leap to this part about tyrants, that they try to accommodate their schemes as much as they can to the appearance of justice and reason, right? And to deceive those whom they resolve to destroy or oppress by presenting to them a miserable picture of freedom when the inestimable original is lost. Now, what do we think about that? Now, this is how tyrants work. Try to make things appear just and reasonable. What do you think, Walter?
So just why a tyrant? So why a tyrant needs to make things appear just and reasonable?
Sure. Yeah, just sort of
Okay.
how you feel about that sentiment in this quote.
Okay, well, a tyrant, if they don't make their argument or their side appear just and reasonable, then they would have to like use force or something, and that could make people not like them as much, and then they could be dethroned or yeah.
Yeah, right. It's so interesting to me. Sometimes I love to. I've heard this a couple times now, but I like to think of an analogy, the analogy of a cake, of baking a cake, and in the middle of the cake, filling it with worms. And of course, I mean, if you told somebody that you were going to feed them worms for dinner, well, I don't think you'd have many people sitting down to your table. But if you cover those worms with appealing chocolate and strawberries or whatever you like, and put some nice frosting all over it, so the worms are just in the middle, but yet you encase those worms in something beautiful, in something that looks great. Well, you'll get a lot more customers to come and sit and eat at your table before they're able to realize, wait a minute, I'm actually eating worms. I think there are just so many modern day connections to that. Would Heidi or Wendy, or would you like to perhaps speak about any connections that you make?
Well,
The
just
only thing-
the analogy
sorry.
I already made. Sorry, go ahead, Heidi.
No, go ahead, Wendy.
Well, the analogy I already made about the economy, that the picture they're giving us now that everything's okay, that's supposed to make us think that that was the original. I just thought of, as you were speaking, I just thought of the quote at the time when they were doing all those bailouts. I think I actually heard someone say that we had to destroy the free market in order to save the free market.
Mm-hmm.
And that's definitely the appearance of justice and reason to deceive us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for that bit of relating there. And Heidi, did you want to share too?
Well, the only thing that I was thinking of was that Mr. Heyman often talks about the three things that will destroy a church, and he also says will destroy a nation. And one of those things is flattering leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is making me think of that.
Uh-huh. Thank you for that, and I appreciate that application to the wonderful class that Mr. Heyman teaches. This one here I love. For who are a free people? Not those over whom government is reasonable and equitably exercised, but those who live under a government so constitutionally checked and controlled that proper provision is made against it being otherwise exercised. I love this here because the first time I read this quote, I honestly had to read it again because I was thinking, wait a minute. Well, aren't we free if government is reasonable and equitably exercised? But wait, Dickinson is saying, no, not even that, right? That is too much government. He's saying that government must be so constitutionally checked and controlled that proper provision is made against it being otherwise exercised. For the sake of time, let's just think about that one there in terms of the size of government and perhaps what the founders felt about it. But this one I really wanted to make sure we got to because it's so wonderful. It ties in John Locke again. Heidi, would you read this one for us, please?
Sure. If they have any right to tax us, then, whether our own money shall continue in our own pockets or not, depends no longer on us, but on them. There is nothing which we can call our own, or to use the words of Mr. Locke, what property have we in that which another may by right take when he pleases to himself?
Okay. So what do we think about this one? I love this quote.
Well, how can we call it ours if someone can just come and take it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not our property anymore.
Excellent, right? And so here, I think it's so important to note that Dickinson is saying, you don't have any right to tax us. If you're really regulating, well, then it's regulation, and it's not taxing. But you don't have any right, Parliament, to tax us because you're doing it in a way that you can just take our property whenever you please because you don't have our consent. And I love thinking about this quote. Once again, of course, and I think Heidi mentioned this before, those who are taxed without their own consent expressed by themselves or their representatives are slaves. We are taxed without our own consent expressed by ourselves or our representatives. We are, therefore, slaves. And so as we think about this, what do you think? Do you think the colonists were slaves, or is this just a little too melodramatic? Is this just hyperbole? What do you think?
I don't think it's melodramatic at all because I think, people say now when you express your concerns about things, they think you're being melodramatic. Mm-hmm. But I don't think they are. I don't think people are vigilant enough about keeping their freedom. I mean, even reading these letters to me, I thought, wow, they're paying like such close attention to every little word they're putting in these different letters, how they rewrote the Stamp Act a few times and how each time he said, wait, I don't like how they're changing this. I mean, I was having to read it really carefully to even see the difference myself. I was going, what's the difference?
Right.
But to me, they were so vigilant about, wait a minute, what are they doing? So they were just automatically very cautious, and we aren't cautious at all anymore. We just assume that, it must be for our own good.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that. I love that. Excellent relating. That was really exceptional. Anyway, so wonderful quotes to think about. Well, just in summary, let's just make sure we're all on the same page here with the importance of Dickinson. His letters flatly refuted the internal is bad, external is okay argument. All taxation, Dickinson wrote in his famous pamphlet, being an imposition to raise money is essentially the same, and so there is no difference between external and internal taxation. Parliament had no right to levy taxes on Americans for any purpose. This is very important. So parliamentary taxes raised revenue without consent, therefore they're unconstitutional. Regulatory authority, of course, was different. If it truly was just regulatory authority, and I have a couple quotes here I just want to end with. Over the American colonies, Parliament must have all the power, but only the power necessary to maintain the essential connections of empire, and this meant the power to regulate commerce and other aspects of the economy in such a manner as England thought most conducive to their mutual advantage and her own welfare. The duties imposed in the course of such regulation, he made clear, would be legitimate, for such external impositions do not grant property away, but only prevent its acquisition. And that's the important distinction that Dickinson would make between raising a revenue and just regulating. He took the examination of Britain's sovereignty to a new level. These letters truly were such an important piece of the colonial protest against Great Britain. In admitting that Parliament had such regulatory authority, but yet no taxing powers whatever over America, Dickinson was approaching a conception of sovereignty different in essence from what had been accepted hitherto. For in assuming an empire to be basically different from a unitary nation, he was saying now explicitly that its sovereign body need not be supreme everywhere and in all matters in the territory it controlled, but only on some issues and in some ways, and that other lesser bodies, like the colonial legislatures, might exercise absolute and arbitrary powers, sovereign powers in effect, within spheres specifically allotted to them. And so I just want to leave you, because unfortunately we're out of time, but I just want to leave you thinking about how Dickinson's concept of divided sovereignty would become so important, not only in the argument against Parliament, but also for our own nation. Because if we think about divided sovereignty, don't we have it in the Constitution, right? In the federalism of the Constitution, right? In having powers given to the national as well as state governments and having them both be sovereign at times. And it's interesting to think of this conception of divided sovereignty, and this would be a huge contribution that Dickinson's letters from a Pennsylvania farmer would make. Well, think about those things and how they relate to us today, and then as you think about those things, I hope that we'll all look forward to Wednesday's class. We'll be talking about Thomas Jefferson's A Summary Review of the Rights of British America, which is another incredibly influential pamphlet because of the ideas that it puts forth in moving the cause of revolution one step further towards separation. So thank you so much for your time today, and then I'll look forward to seeing everybody on Wednesday.
All right, thank you.
Bye.
Okay. Take care. Bye.